I'm Stephanie Wilson, and you're listening to Freedom Over Fascism. Hi, friends. I had a wonderful conversation with Lindsay Winslow Brown, an elementary school teacher in Indiana and a social media influencer known on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook as Rising from the Red. Lindsay's videos ask whether viewers know the stories behind our American mythology and gives fascinating details about various stories from our history and memory. She talks about the value of asking why as we teach our kids and learn for ourselves. And we talk, as I did with Kevin Levin, about the purposes of myth making and why it's important to know the real stories behind the tidy, flattened, safe myths we're taught about our own story. Please subscribe to her at Rising from the Red on Substack, follow her on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook, also at Rising from the Red. And please subscribe to Freedom Over Fascism to help us bring you conversations like this with real Americans who are fighting fascism with knowledge and understanding, and will help us imagine a new future when this moment is over. That's at www.freedomoverfascism.us. If you can afford it, please choose a paid subscription, which is discounted to $10 a year. Also, check out the conversations I have live on Substack several times a week with other creators who are doing the work. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Lindsay Winslow Brown, welcome to Freedom Over Fascism.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I ran across you on Instagram, and I know you do a lot on Instagram and TikTok. You talk a lot about myth and misunderstandings and understandings of the history of the United States. And you're a teacher in Indiana. And so you do these little vignettes of what the myth is and what were some historical facts behind it that people may or may not know. And listeners of this podcast may know that my training is in history and memory. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what a myth is and why it exists. And a foundational myth is a story that most of the people in the society know as like a founding moment of that society, even if they don't have very much personal connection. My family got here in the early 1900s. Yours is actually descended from those folks. But it doesn't matter because the point of it is to create these mutual origin stories. And it's not so much a lie as opposed to the truth. It's just as you say, a flattening of the historical record to make it simple and safe. So as you talk about in your videos, you kind of take little moments, big moments, landing at Plymouth, Jamestown, Lewis and Clark, all the things, Paul Revere, and you give a little bit of information about it that folks may not already know. So I would love it if you would tell us a little bit about how you got started, but most importantly, why you think this is important. And maybe
Absolutely.
get into one of the stories that,
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting journey. I've always been a lover of history. That started when I was a little girl, and then I actually pulled up. I was pulling out some things this morning. This is from when I was 13 years old, and this
oh my
is
goodness.
my very first family genealogy. And I did it as a project when I was in 8th grade. I had a phenomenal history teacher, and it led me down this whole rabbit hole. And I was super blessed. I knew I was very, very young when my great grandmother died. She was born in 1884. And I have like pictures and I have some like early foundational memories with her. Um, my granddad was born in 1911 on the day of the running of the first Indianapolis 500. And then my grandma was born just a few years after that. And they came from big families. And I had access to all of these people when I was growing up. And so that was really fun. So when I had the opportunity to do a family genealogy, when I was in the 8th grade. It just made sense. And they'd saved all these things. They'd saved family Bibles and handkerchiefs and swimming certificates, all kinds of things. Um, and so that really made me love history, going to old cemeteries, things like that. Um, the other thing is, so I loved history and I grew up in a deeply religious fundamentalist home. We would call it white Christian nationalism today, as scholars have defined it. Um, but that was just Tuesday for me. um,
Mhm.
so, I mean, there was not like, there's going to church, but church was my entire culture that I grew up in. I'm the oldest of 6 children. They had their quiver full. The youngest is a boy. Um, my dad, had his own business, and so I helped him a lot in his work, and I was parentified very much as a child for my younger siblings. Um, there was no separation of, like, sermons and talk radio. So, he would be at a job site, and I'd be with him, and so you would hear Chuck Colson, and then you'd hear Rush Limbaugh, and then you would
Mhm.
hear D. James Kennedy, and then you would hear someone else, and so there was this huge mix of republicanism and Christianity, and not just Christianity, it was, the Bible's the inerrant word of God, and to question any of that is wrong. And there was also rapture theology tied up in that. And these were good people, but it led to some really harmful things. And I left home when I was 17 because of some of the harm. And it was a really difficult time, and in that, because I left home, I was viewed as rebellious. I wasn't leaving home to do drugs. I wasn't leaving home to because I was pregnant. I was leaving home because I didn't feel safe. Um, and there were a lot of things that were tied up in that. Um, at that point in time in history, my contribution to college was based on what my parents made. I ended up being emancipated, and even being emancipated, um, my contribution was still based, on them, and they absolutely refused to fill out any financial aid paperwork. So I applied for scholarships, and I got a full ride scholarship, an academic scholarship, through Eli Lilly, and, studied at DePaul University, earned degrees in history and art history. Supported myself through school, got very close with my history professor, um, thought in the beginning that I would be, I don't know what I wanted to be. I loved learning, I loved science. I started out as a biochemistry major,
Mm.
um, so but I took an art history class my first semester and then wound up getting degrees in both history and art history, working as a reporter, for years after graduation, then writing for different organizations in their marketing departments. When I got pregnant with my 2nd child, I was like, "Ugh, I don't think I can do this anymore. I'm gonna stay home with my baby, my 2nd baby for a little while." Um, and someone had literally come to my door, knocked on it, offered me Starbucks, and said, "Will you please come and teach at my preschool?" So I was like, "Yeah, I don't think I'm a preschool teacher." And they're like, "No, I think you are a teacher." Um, and I am, and I love it. And I ended up doing art with preschoolers for 3 years, got my master's in education, elementary ed specifically, and I've been teaching elementary art, at a Title I district in Indiana for the last 8 years.
Wow.
So, yeah, that's kind of, how I got to here, and then in terms of, um, really have gone through a large religious deconstruction. I would say it started in college, but it's really interesting that, I was questioning all these things, noticing all these things, like, how do we get imagery of the devil, and why do we have cathedrals? And when you start asking those questions, it leads to some kinda dark places. But
Mhm.
I feel like from a neurological standpoint, your brain gravitates toward what it's familiar to. So I graduated from school and I started going to church again and had a baby. And it's just like, this is what I'm supposed to do. And the longer I was there, I was in Bible studies and choirs and church camp, and I did the whole thing. Um, I just had so many questions, and I
Mhm.
was really starting to get reprimanded for those questions. And you shouldn't ask those things and you need to submit to your husband. And I would just get angrier and angrier and angrier. And then I thought I was being like disobedient to God. And eventually you kind of reach the point of like, This is just wrong. Like, this disagrees with my values." So, by the presidential, election season, 2015, 2016, like, I was really checked out, but still kind of going because most people in the red state of Indiana are involved, and I live north of Fort Wayne. Fort Wayne is known as the city of churches. So anyway, that's how I got here. We ended up completely leaving organized religion altogether. We tried different places, different churches, different things, and we were out. But I realized in going through that, um, in addition to there being a religious deconstruction, there's also a historical deconstruction that starts to take place.
Mhm.
And then at somewhere along the line, I still communicated with my parents and with my family. I felt a huge sense of responsibility to my younger siblings. Um, Parentification dies really hard,
Mhm.
and so in all of that, I was still relating to my father, and he passed away in 2018. It was very hard, but also what was interesting, what showed up in me was this massive sense of relief,
Mhm.
and in that relief, there was also even more freedom to be like, "Oh, there's more out there."
Right.
Um, so so I've been writing, I've been doing other things, I've been doing just on my own, traveling and meeting people and talking and reading. Earlier this year, we had a caucus in our county for the Democratic Party, which was fledgling. Like, we haven't had a Democrat on the ballots here in about 10 years, with the
Right.
exception of some small town races here and there. So, even while there are Democrats, many of them identify as Republicans because that's the only way that they can have their voice heard. For some people who may be Democrats, they actually also run as Republicans because there's not even campaign financing to support those elections. So there was a
Right, and
caucus.
we've talked about that a lot on here.
Yes.
Starting off, but when I started the podcast, it was really about red state, particularly Indiana politics. So, um, I've uh, the listeners and I have lots of stories and some background there. So I don't think you're telling our folks
Anything
something they
new.
don't know about.
Yeah, but I can tell you as a lived experience, like, it is not easy. Um, so there was a Democratic caucus here, and there'd been some people that had just kind of barely been keeping the party afloat. Like, maybe they would meet at a pancake house for coffee once a year or twice a year. And those were good people. And it's like, democracy dies in silence. Democracy dies in quiet. Democracy dies when people stop having kitchen table conversations. And at this point, I was like, we know too much, like, to not do anything. And
Mhm.
so there was a group of us that got together. Um, and it's kind of a long story, but short. I'm the chair of our Democratic Party here.
Mm.
And then we had a social media presence, and there were things that were going on in the Indiana legislature that people didn't understand with regard to healthcare, with regard to changes in the law regarding education. And so I started making a couple of videos, and we started really attracting the algorithm reached out to a lot of people. And all of a sudden, we went from 3 or 4 people in our meetings to 40 to 60 people in our meetings, to our mailing list growing to like more than like 200 people. And like this year at the fair, for example, so our county fair is this week. We're one of the latest fairs in Indiana. Um, in years past, there were 1 or 2 or 3 people to be at the fair booth. This year, we had like 60 volunteers. Every single
Wow.
every single shift was covered. Um, and this is just people grassroots organizing. Um, but long story short, and not really, all my stories tend to be long and I ramble, but we had several videos that were made. And my sister in law, who is in her early 20s, she's like, "You should put these on TikTok." And I was like, "Okay." So I was on TikTok one time to get a chicken recipe, and I have no idea how it works. And she's like, "I think you just hit the plus button and maybe give it a title." She's like, "Just put some of your stuff on there and see what happens." So that was May, and, like,
Of
0
this year?
of this year. Uh-huh.
Oh
Yeah,
my
like,
goodness.
I put a chicken recipe on TikTok, or I didn't put a chicken, that was my only experience, and then I put some videos on, and, very quickly by July, I'd hit 10,000 followers, and then I was getting messages from people, and they're like, "Oh, hey," and I kinda started to shift from just talking about Indiana politics and connecting with people. People would ask questions about, like, "How do you know that's true? What's the history behind that?" So then I started kind of weaving in some of those things, and then I've really found this, um, lane. There's religious deconstruction, but there's also historical deconstruction, and history is greater than myth. And it's not that people, I don't know. I'm not necessarily sure that people set out to tell us lies, or if the story has been flattened so much over time that we just fill in the blanks, because where
A
there are
little bit of
gaps
both.
in our information, people just fill it in with something.
Mhm.
Um, so I had people reaching out on TikTok going, "Hey, my sister-in-law is only on Instagram. Do you have an Instagram?" And so I took my personal account and I just changed it to Rising from the Red, which literally means, like, I'm rising up from the red as a blue dot in Indiana. I'm rising up from the red of the horrific things I learned in religion. I'm rising up from the red, like, think like Phoenix, like there's almost this rebirth.
Right.
And so I put a couple videos on Instagram, changed my name, never really checked it. That was tied to a Facebook page that I had created a long time ago. And so in August, I clicked on my Instagram and I had like 15,000 followers. And since then, it's doubled to 30. And then I also discovered one day at the end of August that I had a Facebook following, and they were on there talking about the merits of pilgrims and the differences between Puritans and pilgrims, and, yeah, arguing if Rembrandt knew the pilgrims in Leyden. And so, um, yeah, it's really interesting. Rembrandt might have met some pilgrims in Leyden, but he was really young because he was born in, like, 1604, and the pilgrims were gone by 1620. So, like, it's just
He probably
been
didn't
really,
run in the same circles either.
no, they didn't really run in the same circles, and the people that he painted pictures of weren't pilgrims, they were wealthy Dutch merchants. So, um, anyway, it's all happened so fast. So, I'm figuring it all out, and just very transparently, I'm figuring it out. So, there you go.
Well, I think it's so interesting. I mean, I trained as a historian and, um, I go deeper in the historical, uh, understanding of everything I come across because I'm a little bit nerdy like that.
I love
Uh,
that.
but, and I also live in Massachusetts, where, my kid was so I live in Lexington, Massachusetts. So every year, on somewhere near April 17th, that Monday that's closest, is called Patriots Day. It's a holiday in Maine and Massachusetts, because Maine used to be part of Massachusetts, and it's to commemorate the Battle of Lexington, and I live in the Battle of Lexington, as many of my listeners will know, because on my Substack, I often put up pictures of what's going on in Lexington, Massachusetts,
Yes.
like, on the 4th of July, so, uh so there's a reenactment every year of Paul Revere riding up to, Buckman's Tavern and talking to John Hancock and Samuel Prescott and Samuel Adams, and Prescott moving on along with, Paul Revere. Paul Revere gets arrested, Prescott continues to Concord, and then the battle happens there. So all of that is not news to me, although when I first moved here, uh, I lived, near Cambridge, and in Cambridge Common, which is where George Washington first rallied the troops when he first became the head of the Continental Army, they camped in Cambridge Common, and that now there are, signs up saying, "This is part of the path that Paul Revere and Dawes and, Prescott took," and I was like, "Oh, there are more than Actually, I knew because, it was one of the little factoids in US history, in AP US history 35 years ago that, I had picked up on, but the "This is the path" with little, golden, uh, marks in the sidewalk was really exciting to me. Because I grew up in Southern California where, yes, there was history, but nothing as exciting as revolutionary history. So and also, so my kid in elementary school would go to some of these places, would go to, um, the Lexington Battle Green, it was right in the middle of town, would go to some of the cemeteries. And when he was really young, we took him to Plymouth Plantation, which is now Plymouth Patuxent Museum, which
Mhm.
had, uh in which the first, um the Pilgrims, had come and lived, and so it's one of those living museums where they have actors in a town answering questions, and then they have an area of modern day, um so those actors are pretending to be from the 1600s, and then they have an area where natives, mostly Wampanoags, tell, people what their present day is like and what the past activities their ancestors might have done. So it's
Mhm.
a really interesting way to tell the story of both the colonists and the Wampanoag. Um, and I know that you've talked about Pilgrim history a lot, but can that was a long way around to saying, can you talk about one of the more um one of the vignettes that you may have told people that got the most surprised reaction?
Wow. Um,
Or where you seem to
yeah,
have, told people something that they had never even considered?
yeah, I think one of them, um, so I have so my family, one side, my mom's side came over on the Mayflower. My dad's family, they were Quakers. Um, and so that's always been interesting to me, and especially because the genealogy gets a little bit scrappy, coming from the Caribbean to, the Carolinas. And so there's been a lot of digging in there, but then realizing, the relations between the different places that caused me to do more reading. And I have a friend here, who's so there were my maiden name's Winslow. There were Winslows on the Mayflower. We're not direct descendants of those, but they are in our family tree. So there's a lot that I've read about Edward Winslow. My mom's direct descendant was William Brewster. So there's a lot to read about those people. And my friend's um, relative is Stephen Hopkins. And so there's a brilliant Edward Winslow wrote a Mort's Relation, and they talk about it reads like a journal in terms of like these different things that they went on and like expeditions. And so one of them, they were meeting with King Massasoit, and there's this talk of they were honored guests. And so King Massasoit's like, "Hey, you can sleep in my bed." And people are like, "Native Americans didn't have beds." Well, like they did. Like they slept up off the ground, and they're like, "Men wouldn't have slept together." Well, they did, and things were different. Things are different in the 1600s, just like I tell my students at school, like, things were different in the 1900s. I didn't have the internet. Um anyway, but this story and, like, Edward Winslow literally says something like, "Well, we were kinda choosing between the mosquitoes outside and, like, the lice and fleas inside." And so that was something that was surprising, and in that, like, people are like, "Native Americans had, like, structural homes?" And yeah, they did. Like, not all Native Americans had teepees. And so and then it's like, not all Native Americans had wigwams, and you think about the building materials that are around you, like, that's what you're gonna build with. And so there was even a comment I read the other day, because that took me into reading, some of William Bradford's journal, where they talked about getting off the ship in 1620, and they're kinda scouting things out, and they go to Patuxet, And there are skeletal remains on the tables because the people died so quickly of the epidemic. And, um, people have a lot it's not always about judgment, it's a lot of times about observation. So, what one person might have viewed as absolute tragedy, another person in that time period saw as, "Oh, we have a place to stay, and this is God's providence." And people have a really hard time reckoning with that, and it generated some really interesting conversation. And then it goes into, stories about they found, corn that had been buried. Well, that was, like, part of a grave. And so then you're like, "You're calling the Pilgrims grave robbers, and they were good people." I'm not assigning judgment. I'm saying this is what the historical record shows. Um,
So
and
just to be clear,
yeah,
I'm gonna pause you.
yeah, thank you.
So that they got off the Mayflower, they find a completely built village
Yeah,
that was, that had been, Wampanoag village where everyone was dead,
everyone was
and
dead.
then they moved into it and
They
made it
did.
their own. Okay, now you
They
can
were wiped
continue.
out, and I'm sure like, they were wiped out by an epidemic so quickly that they couldn't even bury all of their dead, which is why there were skeletal remains inside some of the structures. So, um, which I think leads to a lot of really great questions from there, and the best question I think someone can ask in whether they're deconstructing or they're looking at the mythology of something is, "Huh, why? Why did they have an epidemic in 1616 to 1619?" There were other settlers who were there. There were people that were, fishing and wanting to try to grow things, and they were trading. Like, there was a large presence. The Pilgrims weren't the first. Like, Jamestown wasn't the first. St. Augustine, Florida, that was the first city in our country, and it was Spanish. Like, so there's a lot of
Well, the
nuance
first
that
European city,
first European,
because a
thank you.
lot of those native
Absolutely.
people had far more urban lives than we
Than we
understand
give them
now.
credit
Yeah.
for, and then we understand. Um, Yeah, and so there's all of this nuance, and then it's this and you can see it just even in the comments and conversations that people have, like, how do you reckon with that nuance? How do you unflatten this and and come to terms with it? Um, and it's, like, if your listeners have traveled abroad, like, if you've gone to a city like Rome or Athens, you can see how they've had to come to reckon with their own past. I mean, Rome is a city, and you think about all the things that have happened there for all the thousands of years, and the city literally, as they begin to excavate it, it looks like lasagna. You
Mhm.
see structures built on top of structures built on top of structures. And when you go through there with historical guides, they're like, "Oh yeah, this was the Byzantine era, and so they just painted over this room. And when you go to Palatine Hill, you're going to notice these things. When you go to Athens, they're like, yeah, so Athena won this battle, and so there's an olive tree up there." Well, Athena wasn't real. And there's an olive tree there, but I don't think that's a 2,000-year-old olive tree. I mean, if you think about all the war and devastation and stuff that happened and the battles that happened at the Parthenon and all the rebuilding, like, that is not the original olive tree. But these are stories that we tell ourselves, those founding myths, but they
Mhm.
acknowledge them as myths. In our country, what I'm seeing is they don't acknowledge the complexity of the story or the simplicity of the story. Um, they just don't. The mythology even of the story. So, and I think that this is a real concern, especially moving forward. I saw an announcement from the DOE this week talking about making civics education more patriotic in our country. Well, what does that mean? And who's defining that? And who's writing those lessons? And then you start to see the organizations that they have involved. And that raises some deep concerns for me. And that makes the work, I think, Stephanie, that you're doing so important to the integrity of our story moving forward. So,
Thank you. I think what you're doing is, I mean, in short bursts, very important for people to understand, uh, that what their kids might be taught in school and have been in various other states is, uh, very sanitized version. Last week, I talked to Kevin Levin, who's a Civil War historian. We talked about how does how are some of the ways in which African American history gets erased and why, or uh, you know, the changing of way markers by the Park Service to tell a particular story.
Mhm.
And I think in a lot of ways, this is all part of the same thing, which is they want to be telling a particular story about the past
Mhm.
that supports their narrative in the present.
Correct.
Um, I would love to hear a couple more of your um, the vignettes that really again
Uh-huh.
prompted a lot of conversation because I think I find it really interesting, um, to deconstruct some of those myths and be like, "Oh, well, you know, Jamestown with the" I watched the series on Netflix or wherever it was, and it seemed pretty, gritty,
Mhm.
um, but, you know, Jamestown had a very particular, uh, very dark beginning.
Mhm.
Um, so I don't necessarily want you to talk about Jamestown, but just some of those little vignettes that people might not know because it's just so woven in to our conception of ourselves that even the thought that um, the earliest colonies were started by companies for
Mhm.
profit is
Yeah.
something that we don't even think about or know.
Yeah. Okay, so I think I'll start with, gosh, there's so many good ones, but there are a couple. You hear blanket statements a lot, and it's not that they're not true, it's that there's a lot more nuance and more depth to it, which makes it really interesting and potentially more powerful. So, I heard a lot growing up that our country was founded on religious freedom. And so in in talking about it, you're like, "Okay," as a kid, you're like, "Yeah, that makes sense." And then you're, reading your Bible every day and your dad's listening to this talk radio, and then you maybe see, oh my goodness, I'm thinking of like all the televangelists on television. You see all these things, and you're like, "Well, that really makes sense. This country's founded on religious freedom, and I'm surrounded entirely by a religion that I can, practice freely, and my family can." Um, so but then there would also be this messaging that I would get growing up around persecution, like, "Oh, Christians are so persecuted." And I'd be like, "Huh, we're practicing freely, but we're so persecuted." So there's like this threat and this fear. So you have the fear of persecution, you have the fear of that being taken away from you. So I was reading an article about the Pilgrims, and I knew that they had gone to Holland. And for whatever reason, and I can't even remember the article at the time, and it's probably been 10 or 12 years ago, I'm like, why did the Pilgrims go to Holland first? And so then you start reading about England, and you're like, well, things were changing in England in the 1500s and the 1600s. And you think about all this religious war and turmoil and all these different religious groups. And then you have enclosure laws. So um, it used to be in England that people could graze their animals freely. And then all of a sudden you have these enclosure laws that come in. And so economically, land is being cut off from different groups of people, kind of like not quite like an elimination of the middle class, but it was really being things were being taken away from them. So, and then in terms of the leadership that you had in the country at the time, um, Mary, Henry VIII, I mean, I'm not saying them in order at all right now, but you had people being uh, executed, imprisoned, fined for their religious beliefs, not being in alignment with those of the crown. Um, so I'm like, okay, well, this makes sense why they'd want to leave, but why Holland? Well, um, if you've been to England, there are lots of sheep everywhere. Sheep produce wool. I'm a big fan of Settlers of Catan. I love playing board games. And, you want wool, you want your wool port. I'm sure that there are some Settlers of Catan people out there. But they had all this wool and they would send it to Holland. And Holland is where you had more weaving and stuff that took place. So they had business connections there. So, yes, they were religious. and they had business connections in Holland. Well, then it's pretty interesting too when the Pilgrims and Puritans and Quakers and other groups wanted out. And they're all really part of like this umbrella separatists. Like, think about just there are people within that that had different viewpoints. Um, and like all pilgrims are Puritans, but not all Puritans are pilgrims. Like, there's kind of, yeah, there's some great debates that we've had online about pilgrims and Puritans. But group of pilgrims wanting to leave, well, they changed laws in the land that you couldn't leave. And so that meant like you had to bribe somebody, like a ship captain, to take you to Holland. So the first time that a group of pilgrims tried to leave, they were caught. I don't know all of the details of that story, but there were some people who were imprisoned. They later went back to their families. It was probably the ship's captain that took the money and turned them in. But anyway, so they tried again like a year or so later, and it worked, and they got to Leyden, Holland. And so that was an urban city. And it was not like pilgrims were working the fields. Like William Bradford was a weaver. He probably belonged to a local guild. People went to like farmers markets, and there was painting and music, and it was urban. I mean, think about like any city scene that you see. Well, there were 2 issues. Number 1, it was really hard to get ahead financially. And number 2, it was also, they wanted to protect their way of life, and they wanted to protect that for their children. And so they felt like their families were becoming too Dutch. Now, not every pilgrim left Holland, some stayed. But they had some friends, still back in England, and they're like, "Hey, do you guys have any ideas?" And they're like, "Oh my gosh, we got this venture in the New World. We'll finance it for you." Because another question becomes, well, gosh, if they wanted to leave and they were poor, how on earth did they have the money? So then that leads you down another rabbit hole. So then you find out all these connections. And so there's like the Virginia Company, there's adventures, there are all these things working together. The Pilgrims are like, great, let's go. So they gather up their things and they move to Beverly. Not really. They go to London, or not London, they go to England. And so they're like, yeah, we're gonna set off like in the late spring. And
Yeah.
so they've got 2 ships, the Mayflower and the Speedwell. And they try to take off, and the Speedwell like springs some leaks. Bad news. So they go back. So it's a little bit later now. And so by the time they end up leaving, it's September. So I also remember asking that question, like, okay, so they're squeezing onto one ship with all these people. And then like, do they have enough food? Do they have enough water? Like, how's it work? And by the way, the pilgrims also brewed beer, because they all, and a lot of people at that time, it's not because they were drunks, it's because beer was safer to drink than water in so many places. That's another great rabbit hole to go down. But then they get to New England, not even in the spot that they were intending to go to, and it's November, and that's winter. So, do you have enough supplies to get you through until the spring, until March or April? No. And so when you look at the reasons that the pilgrims died on that ship, that nearly half of the people died, like like there's starvation and there's scurvy and they drink bad water. And it's like playing. I mean, I almost wish that there was a game instead of like Oregon Trail, it's like Mayflower Survival. And like you have this much water left, but there's bacteria in it. 3 children have died. Like it was bad. Um, and then like, and William Bradford's wife, who wrote in his journal about, oh, we found this village to live in. What great providence, and none of our people have gotten sick. Well, he was meaning from the epidemic, but half the passengers died, including his wife who drowned. And I have to wonder sometimes, like, and there are some historians that speculate, like, was it accidental or was it just really, really bad? Um, so I think when you start to dig into those stories and how long they'd been in certain places and how they got the financing to go and what their skills actually were, they had no skills when they came here. And so then in walks Squanto. So this leads to the second story. Okay, well, where did Squanto come from and how did he know how to speak English? So a really flat answer would be, well, he spent time with other people who were exploring the coast, other people that were setting up settlements there. Okay, like that is a really great and reasonable answer. But then you see that his entire village was completely wiped out by an epidemic. Why did he live? Like, did he have like this magic cure living in his body? No, like, he had been abducted and taken to Spain as a slave. So not only so this is something else, like, we don't love to talk about slavery in our country, but it was a practice from the very, very, very beginning that came over here from Europe. I mean, even the word slave comes from the word Slav, and so you can go down that rabbit hole of where did slavery come from? So, basically the economy needs an engine. When you don't have machinery, it's people. And that was the practice. That doesn't make it, I don't think it makes it right. We have to look back on it though and go, well, this is what they did, um, and reckon with that. But anyway, so Squanto went to Spain and then also I love people going, oh gosh, things were so different then. Everybody just accepted slavery. And Squanto's story is a great example of like F no, they did not, because there were friars, I think Dominican or Franciscan friars in Spain that were like, yeah, this is wrong, and we're gonna bust you out of here. And so they got him out. He goes to England, and then he comes back to his home, and everyone's dead. And so if we think about, like, I live in Auburn, Indiana, and it's within the state of Indiana. He lived in Patuxent, and within Patuxent, it was part of this Wampanoag Wampin oh my gosh, my pronunciation's so bad sometimes, Wampanoag Confederation. And so he went to, like, his closest allies-ish. But, he might have been too English by that point. I think there was some he got what he could from the Confederacy, he got what he could from the Pilgrims, but he didn't live very long anyway. He died within just a few short years. But he was the one that was credited with showing the Pilgrims how to not plant just corn, but it was corn, beans, and squash and the way that they grew together. Um, but yeah, the Pilgrims had not grown their own vegetables. Like, maybe they had, like, one squash plant in their backyard? I don't know. They were so urban before. So anyway, I feel like I just
Wow. Yeah. No, I think it's really fascinating that, first of all, how we are not trained to ask why, right?
Mhm.
In elementary, whenever you start learning these things, you're like, oh, really cool. And maybe, and the big revelation is that these were real people and these stories are real stories about people's lives, but the things that don't actually make very much sense. You're not
Mhm.
really trained to say, okay, well, why was that? And what was going on in England at the time? And why was there a big Protestant Catholic um, fight in England and France? And what, like it goes back and back and back because history is a timeline where things happen, you
Yeah.
know, backwards and forwards. And that is not encouraged most places. You're
No,
not
I
the first or even the
mm,
second person who is deconstructing their religious upbringing that I've talked to
mhm.
on here. And I think from what I understand about Christianity, questioning is not valued, um, as
No.
much as, say, it is in Judaism, where everything's a question and that's cool. And that's what our whole religion is based on, is asking questions and coming up with different kinds of answers. So, so I find that fascinating as well.
Yeah, and I think 2 things off of that. It became really apparent to me about the question asking, the last time I ever went to a Sunday school class, the minister or not minister, the elder who taught the class, and he was a man because women couldn't teach men because that was, like, evil. Um, that's a whole other thing, but he was saying that he had visited another church the previous Sunday and that they didn't take communion, and he was like, "It's just so awful." It's so sad to be in a service where they just didn't take communion. And I'm sitting there and I've read the Bible backward and forward and studied it inside and out multiple times, only in one language, different translations, but one language. I'm not fluent in Greek or Hebrew. Um, but anyway, I just asked the question. I was like, well, where in here does it say we have to take it once a week? And I'm thinking about supply of food and I'm thinking about what types of calendars do they have? I'm thinking about all the different people groups throughout Eurasia. And the teacher goes, "Well, that was because that was the way that the way did it." That was how it's recorded in Acts, and he, quoted this verse that said, "Well, on the first day of the week, they broke bread." Okay, great. I love that. Thank you for providing me with your reasoning. But if we are truly following the way of that earliest church, why are we not selling all of our possessions and living in a commune? So then I was done with Sunday school. So that was one. And I think something else that's been really powerful in my teaching of art. I have a really busy classroom. So I teach K-5 elementary art. Wonderful, wonderful people that I work with in my district. And they have been so supportive. So we have pottery wheels in my room. We have wood burning, we have printmaking, and I try to make it as hands-on as possible for the children. I also have to teach them how to do these things. And I've
Mhm.
noticed that a large part of teaching children um, how to do things is they have to have trust from inside. They have to be able to trust that they can anticipate what's coming next. And so, how I teach that to children really matters. So, I can go, okay, here are all the steps for printmaking. Here's the demo. Here's the inking plate. Here's your brayer. Here's your ink. Here's your printing plate. Here's the stuff you're going to put it on. Okay, now I want you to go and draw your things and then create. And then I'll get kids that come up to me and they'll ask me questions. And there are people that are right next to them. I'm calling 6-year-olds people because they are. The 6-year-old right next to them is doing this just fine, but then they come to me. And I'm like, "Oh, what's going on? How do I do this?" "Okay, well, what do you think?" And they'll go, "Well, I need to get a piece of paper." "Okay, great. You can do that." Or if they spilled water. "Oh, yeah, totally. I spill water too." "Well, I spilled water." "Okay, great. Yep, not a problem. Not mad at all. It happens." "What do I do?" "Well, what would you do if I wasn't here?" "I'd probably
Right.
go get a towel." "Okay. Are there towels here?" "Yeah." "Do you think you can go get a towel?"
Right.
"Yeah." And it really makes me wonder, and I'm not just saying just for my school, just for the way that we raise our children, just for the grocery store, like, why are we not supporting, like, children, like, back to your question of why can't grown-ups ask why? Probably because when they were 5, somebody screamed at them for for spilling water, or for not encouraging them to go and figure it out, or to ask a friend, or to support them in building trust in themselves. So, I think there's a correlation between how we teach children to problem solve as young children in school, out of school, and I'm talking public, private, Christian, wherever. How are we teaching them to problem solve? And then when they get older and they have these thoughts, encourage those thoughts. Be curious. Go to the library. Check out a book. How to use a card catalog. Like, you can do it in Chat GPT. That
I'm
makes it
sorry,
easy.
card catalog? Card catalog?
Card catalog.
I
It's
don't quite understand what you're saying there.
the drawers, and they smell really great. John Dewey, that's most of the stuff. But
Oh, I asked I have my son is 17, my niece is 17, and my other niece is 14, and we were just together, for the Jewish New Year, and I said, "Hey, guys, what do you think the yellow pages are?" And they're like, "Uh, somebody peed on them?" I'm just like, yeah, they're just like, "Oh." I find it really funny.
oh
Anyway,
my
I'm
god.
sorry, that was
That
total
no, that's
digression.
fantastic. We had been on vacation, we were driving somewhere, and we stopped in this little rest stop, and they still had a phone book there, and my 16-year-old son at the time, he picked it up, he's like, "Oh, what's this? Does this tell us about, like, local parks or, hiking trails or something?" And everybody there, like, was our age except for him and his younger brother, and we just had a field day with it, and it's like, "Oh my gosh, phone books disappeared, you know, from places in my lifetime." But
There's a lot that disappeared in our lifetimes.
yeah, but there's a lot also at our fingertips now too. Like,
I
if
yes.
somebody's curious about something, you can literally in Google just type your question. And you have to learn how to vet your sources, and you have to learn how to find out, like, what's good information versus what's not good information. people also have things like cars and public transportation that they can go to these places. So if you're curious about Plymouth Rock, go there. If you're curious about, which is just a pebble, like it's not really a rock. That's another
We
one.
didn't even bother going because
No, no, because why?
there's a
Why?
plaque. That's it.
Yeah. So there are just so many great ways that we can seek out information. And then um, also, I think as people seek information, not shaming people is really important. Like it is so easy for me sometimes, like as a teacher, to want to be like, oh my gosh, do you know how to clean a paintbrush? Like, oh my gosh, like I'm teaching kindergartners this week how to use watercolors and they love it. But painting with 25 kindergartners, 24 kindergartners at once can be a little bit overwhelming. And you have to use enough water. Like, you keep digging your brush in these sticky paints, it will not work without the water, but you have to teach them and you have to patiently guide them. Like, "Oh, nope, use more water, use more water. Here are 3 practice pieces of paper. See if you can make it the least sticky you've ever made it." And I think we have to show up that way for grown-ups too, even if they're older than us. Like, they're learning, and it should not be something where you feel ashamed to learn and to ask questions. It needs to be a normal thing to ask questions and not receive judgment.
I think that is one of the most important things I've heard in a long time because we we want people to know the truth or some deeper understanding, but don't necessarily support the asking of questions or the answering of questions and expect people to learn things on their own when it's not really even clear where they should go to learn or they should talk to and who's willing to talk. And uh, so I think that is a really important point, especially in this moment where everything's changing so fast. We're recording this on Friday, September 26th, and I don't know what's going to happen by Monday. And so, like,
I don't know. I haven't even made a new bingo card in a while because I just don't know what's going to happen.
no, I mean, every day, and I understand why people completely disengage because it's really hard to pay that much attention
Mhm.
and stay sane.
Yeah. It's part of the
So for the
strategy.
It is part of the strategy, and part of my strategy, as I say many, many times on here, is that hope is a series of actions. And for me, the series the actions of doing these podcasts actually provide me with a sense of agency and hope. Whereas if I didn't do anything and just disconnected, I would be, like, spiraling nonstop. So, like, everybody has a different way of dealing with it.
Mhm.
And I get the sense that you putting information about, little backstories about various moments in our history helps you as well to sort through what's going on.
It does.
Um,
I guess I'm curious to hear from you, Stephanie. One of the things that I am struggling with right now, like I teach full time. I became the chair of our Democratic Party here. I'm involved with the union at my school, and I started content creation. And I feel like all of that work is really important. All that work is in alignment with my values. And it's like, I don't, sometimes I don't know how to find that balance. Not that like you and I are responsible for single-handedly, holding up democracy, saving it, educating people, because we're not. And in this season of so many opportunities, like how do you find that balance?
I think that's really, really hard. And something that my husband says that I repeat is you can't boil the ocean. You can do your
Mhm.
piece, and that's all you can do. Like everything is happening all at once everywhere, and you can't boil the ocean. So, um,
Okay.
do your little spot. So that's my moment of zen. Um, for
I like
you
that.
and for everybody else is like, you do it's like one of the sayings from the Jewish sages is that you're not required to complete the work, nor are you allowed to not do it. There's a more graceful way of saying that, but you got to start, but
Mhm.
you're not required to finish.
Mm, that's
So
helpful. Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a guiding thing. Like, yeah, it might take more than our lifetimes. We don't know, which is
All
also
indications do point to yes.
yes. I know. Yeah. Lindsay, thank you so much for coming on. This is one of
Well,
the
thank
best
you.
conversations I've had in a long time, and I hope the
Same.
listeners and the watchers, because we're going to post it um, everywhere, will
Excellent.
get a kick out of it. And I invite you back anytime to talk
Yeah.
about whatever you like.
And for my people, what all channels can they find you on besides Substack?
Okay. So Substack is the best place, but it's easy. Freedomoverfascism.us will take you right there.
Perfect.
I have an Instagram, but I don't really post much on it. And I also have a YouTube, but everything there can be found on Substack. Um, I think it's Freedom Over Fascism Pod on YouTube. Um, can you tell once again to the people listening to you for the first time among my listeners, where do they find you?
Yeah. So if you go to TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, depending on what your preferred um, method of interacting on social media is, I'm at Rising from the Red and no spaces, just put it all together. And then on Substack, I'm also at Rising from the Red. So my content across TikTok, Facebook, Instagram tends to be pretty similar. And then on Substack is where I write more. I include my sources. So I have free and paid available on there just to give people a wide variety. Some people just like the little nuggets on Instagram. Some people are like, oh, I need to go down this rabbit hole. And then
Right.
at the end of my rabbit hole, I give you a plethora of other things that you can read so that you can continue digging deeper on the things that really resonate with you.
That sounds great. So everybody subscribe to Lindsay, subscribe to Freedom Over Fascism, and let's all do this together.
Sounds
Thank
great.
you
Thank
so
you so much
much.
for having me. This
Right.
has been so much fun.
Thank you for listening to Freedom Over Fascism. Please subscribe at www.freedomoverfascism.us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
These are difficult times, and if you believe in justice, progress, and democracy, the news you read and listen to can be pretty depressing. And that's why there's a new podcast called Good News for Lefties and America. Every day it features positive news stories for progressive listeners, because no matter how disturbing the headlines might be, there's always hope we can build on for a better tomorrow. Good News for Lefties and America. Listen on this platform at goodnewsforlefties.com or wherever podcasts are heard.